Hey everybody, it's your friend Adam. I'm here with Dave, the Distributist, and we're doing part 2 of a conversation that we had. I guess it's been over a year now on objective morality. And I had gone in and re-listened to the conversation a couple weeks ago, and we didn't make a lot of headway. And I think a lot of that was just because we were complete strangers on the internet. But now we've
Okay.
interacted quite a bit over the last year or so. So hopefully we'll be able to make more headway on the conversation. How are you doing, Dave?
I'm doing great. I really don't have any idea about where this conversation is going, but I kind of said, oh, I think, what is it? Paul Vanderclay, I like his channel, and he's a pastor, and he did a sort of a rundown on your previous conversations, which I hadn't heard on objective morality, and I didn't get quite through that, but it sounded very interesting at least.
Yeah, you're a proponent of objective morality, correct?
Yeah, oh, all Christians have to be. And it's hard to really say like I'm a proponent of objective morality because the term is it is a question of what you mean by objective morality. I certainly don't mean that there's this object in the world called morality that we could test scientifically. What I mean is a little bit more metaphysical. I think that there is, I mean, this is the question. I think humans, when they say they believe in objective morality, they mean that there is sort of some implicit oughtness in the world, such that we can say this is how things ought to be, and have this be something that is intersubjectively right, such that we could argue over what ought to be and what ought not to be in a way that's meaningful in between different minds, and not something that is something that's meaningless. It's not meaningless to have a conversation with somebody else over what ought to be and what ought not to be. If someone who says morality is subjective, to my mind, he's saying that linguistically it's meaningless to discuss what ought or ought not to be.
Right. So I think towards the end of our conversation last time, we did kind of make some headway where you're talking more in terms of kind of a universal morality or an aspirational morality that could possibly be
Mm.
the best morality that humans could adopt for any situation.
Well, yeah, I mean, you talk a lot about Jonathan Haidt, and Jonathan Haidt, he goes into sort of like what human morality is, like where it comes from. And certainly I endorse the Heidian view of that, since it seems like it has some predictive power. But to me, that's sort of ancillary to the idea of objective morality. We can discuss sort of what human morality tends to be, and using that as a basis for morality is very close to what classical theists or classical thinkers call natural law, sort of like the implicit morality human societies have, and that has caused human societies to survive. But as people like C.S. Lewis have pointed out, you need sort of kind of a minor logical jump to get from that to saying this is the way morality should be.
Let us know in the chat if you can't hear us. I started the stream and people are acting like we're not live. Maybe they're just tripping me out.
I think they're saying that we're early, right? Which
Uh,
I likely
okay.
have to go at 2, so that's the reason why we're early.
I think we started right on time, but
Okay.
anyway, so I missed a little of what you were saying because the chat had me distracted. So you're endorsing the Heidian worldview and obviously Haidt is talking about morality as something descriptive.
Yeah,
And
he's describing how morality anthropologically originates, but that's not the same question to asking whether morality is objective. For instance, mathematics, or our concept of mathematical logic, also has anthropological and biological origins. But it seems like everyone agrees that mathematics is objective. It's objective in the sense that we can consistently come to the same answers, but beyond that, it's also objective in the sense that we have a sense that there is something outside of ourselves that mathematics is pointing to, that mathematical objects just aren't constructions of the human mind. And it seems hard to believe that would be the case, that mathematics are just totally objects described inside the human mind, and we only emotionally associate them with the outside universe.
right. And I have a very different way of looking at objective morality, I think, in terms of how Christians or other people are looking at it. So I'm really curious about their concept of it. And sometimes I feel like there's a disagreement just over semantics over the term objective. Obviously, when you're talking about the term objective in mathematics, it seems like we're in agreement. But sometimes the term objective, people seem to be thinking something differently when we're talking about morality.
Well, mathematics is a good place to start because objective means two things in mathematics. And I think one is controversial and one's not controversial. So the first way and the uncontroversial way that we say that mathematics is objective is that we mean it's formally consistent. So mathematics is what mathematicians would call a formal language, such that if I say a statement in mathematics, it means one and only one thing if properly specified and rigorous. And, if you do mathematics correctly and with the proper rigor, you get to the same answer every single time. There's no interpretation required, as there is in, say, something like music or poetry or just English itself. And this is both mathematics' strength and its ultimate weakness if we go to someone like Kurt Gödel. But the second question to mathematics is mathematics just a formal language that exists only in the human mind? Or is there something mathematical in the universe, some mathematical nature that our mathematical instinct, even though it is anthropologically and evolutionarily derived, is pointing to? And that's the question that I think is fundamentally controversial. And that's not really a question of mathematics. It's a question of the philosophy of mathematics. And it's a question that a lot of different mathematicians have had different answers for.
So what does that have to do with the term objective, whether or not it's something that is a product that is outside of the natural world or only references objects in the natural world?
Well, mathematics is obviously not like a natural object in the sense that we talk about physics or biology.
But isn't it always a representation of the natural world? Isn't that the purpose of mathematics?
In some sense, we describe mathematics things that can't exist in the natural world, and then we find it odd when when the models come up, right? So a classic example of this would be like the imaginary number, the square root of -1. Okay, does the classic formula e to the I pi minus 1 is equal to 0, called Euler's formula, I believe, does that or e to the I pi plus 1 is equal to 0, I think. Does that formula, so that basically involves things that just don't exist in nature. An irrational number doesn't really exist in nature. We can't point to it. An imaginary number certainly doesn't exist, how we have it conceptualized. But what we've been able to use this relationship to, after we developed the relationship, essentially we saw this kind of formula come up again and again in observational physics involving phasors and electricity. So, exactly what is that something that just happened? Is it a coincidence? Is there some kind of mathematical nature to the universe? Is this a product of how we're approaching the universe? These are all good questions, and I think philosophical ones, right? Hello?
I'm here.
Okay, sorry. Maybe I should say, like, it's not clear that mathematics is we develop mathematics from observing the universe, because there's plenty of times where we've developed the formulas, and in some sense relativity is a perfect example of this, where Einstein did the math. We didn't observe relativity and then develop the formulas for it. We observed contradictions in how we understood the universe working, but Einstein so thoroughly believed in the math that he did the math, and then he said, oh, well, let's just redesign our observations or our interpretations of our observations to completely unseat what we thought we were looking at to begin with. And it turned out that this had predictive power. So it's not clear whether rationality follows whether rationality follows observation, or whether it's something that's autonomous.
So if we're going to talk about objective morality, we should define morality too.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I have a very strict definition of morality where I'm saying it's a set of rules that binds people into a cooperative group. I know that's not the custom definition that people are used to, But if I press them, I can usually get them to admit that morality is about behavior and right and wrong behavior. But I think you and I are probably in agreement on that.
Morality is about right or wrong behavior, but it's not clear whether morality is necessarily always relational to groups. It's certainly a large component of it, how humans are organized. But the question is, if you're Robinson Crusoe and you're on a desert island and you're not in a society, can you act immorally? And this is a classic philosophical question, and classically, in the classic Western tradition, you can act immorally even in isolation of a group. Although, there has certainly been philosophers who've come out down on the opposite side of that question.
I could think of situations where you could act immorally all by yourself. So, I don't disagree with you there.
But let's say that the most important section, because to me, morality is anything where you say it ought to be like this, you ought to do this. It's basically any statement made. A moral statement is any linguistic statement made in an imperative sense. You ought to do this, you should do this. That's a moral statement.
And that's situationally linked, correct?
Yeah, but situationally linked is not what people are concerned about when they concern objective morality.
Okay, so explain that to me.
So, for instance, let's say that this is going to be kind of ridiculous, right? But let's say that my moral system says that there just ought to be more blue things in this universe, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this creates this value of blue things, and I'm using a ridiculous example to show you how this works. So saying that this value of blue things therefore implicitly recommends a certain number of actions, like, say, for instance, manufacturing blue paint. Now, maybe in the manufacture of blue paint, you have to create a red machine to manufacture blue paint. But in that situation, making something red is only a way to get more blue paint to make things more blue. So this is you can say that the value might recommend different things at different time. But if you said that this oughtness is something that is objective, or it's just by nature better to have blue things, that value could recommend different actions at different times. Say, for instance, making something red so that you could get more blue paint.
So you bring up an interesting point in that you're kind of separating morality into the goal and then the behavior to achieve that goal. And
yeah, any moral oughtness can be rephrased in terms of a goal. So basically, if you give me a goal, then I can give you morality, right? And the morality will imply a goal.
But doesn't that just double the subjectivity in that different people will have different goals and different people will have different ideas about how to achieve those goals?
The morality. Well, yeah. I mean, there's different levels of it, right? There's what your goal is, and then there's how wise you are in pursuing that goal, right? Usually, the fundamental element of morality is what the goal is.
Okay.
And there's a sense among philosophers that insofar as humans are concerned, the goals humans have are very similar, right? And in some sense, height kind of goes into what the goals of humanity are, just anthropologically speaking.
Right. And this is one of the contentions with Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson wants to bring them back to evolutionary processes, survival and reproduction. And often people claim this is the naturalistic fallacy.
No, I think that you can describe how they arise through natural law, but describing how they arise won't ultimately tell you whether they point to something external. I mean, I know mathematical instinct was developed because we evolved it, right? But that does not tell me that what it's showing me is necessarily not outside of its own production. Like, for instance, my vision was also naturalistically developed, right? It evolved. I have trained myself to read, but that doesn't mean that what I'm seeing right now isn't external to the evolutionary process.
So are Christians using objective morality just as a way to an argument that God exists? I notice that you're pointing to external factors.
Yeah, I mean, so this kind of gets us back to, I mean, there's so many different ways to approach this. So the thing is that Aristotle and Aristotelian teleology. So Aristotle talked about a lot of different ways that we could say something had a cause and effect, and one of them was the idea. So there are proofs of God that do not rely on morality, right? And Aristotle goes over those proofs. So first of all, I should point out that the question of what morality is, what goodness is something that's pre-Christian. And in many ways, insofar as Christians use morality or anything else to prove the existence of God, they're mainly referencing arguments that come from people like Plato and Aristotle.
So as someone who is a pragmatist, what I guess part of my problem is I don't understand how this concept of God is or this concept of morality is really useful in anything other than just philosophically proving that a God exists. If that's, I mean, if you've actually proved it. Obviously I'm an atheist.
Can you, like, useful for what? Can you say more about what your goals are?
For identifying what the rules are, what the right and wrong rules are, what the right and wrong behavior is.
I mean, it's. I mean, so you wanted to you're trying to create law, I guess, is what you're saying, right?
Well, I'm saying that there are right and wrong behaviors that people are arguing over all the time. And I don't necessarily know how we discover how those behaviors are, how we agree upon those behaviors being right and wrong. The whole idea of objectivity is that it's something that we can agree upon regardless of our emotions about it, regardless of our intuitions about it, something that's just an objective fact. Subjectivity is completely taken out of it. So if you're making a case that there is
even height doesn't talk about that, though, right? I mean,
no, I don't
weigh things in different ways, even though they're sort of similar.
But height is not advocating that an objective morality exists. And I think a lot of times people want to make the case that there is only objective morality and there's moral relativism. And it seems like there needs to be something in between there, because you can categorize. I mean, you're not even saying that there is only one morality. You're admitting that there are multiple realities. You're just saying that this objective morality is aspirational. It's a universal morality. It's a theoretical best case morality.
I believe that there is an objective morality. I'm not claiming to be in possession of this, but I'm taking, this is again, this particular conversation we're having right now. It's strange how it does come up a lot with Christians, but most of the things having to do with it are pre-Christian arguments. What I would say is something along the lines of the very Platonic argument. I would say that there are multiple moralities, just like there are multiple triangles, but the moralities are being constructed in the application and in the pursuit of a hypothetically perfect morality, just like imperfect triangles are constructed in an attempt to achieve or represent a hypothetically perfect triangle. And if you wanted to be humanistic about this and say that, oh well, what morality is trying to do is it's trying to preserve the well-being and thriving of humanity, then you immediately go to, okay, what does it mean to be a thriving human? And you could say conversely that the values that guide the objective morality is that which is trying to get us to be closer to the hypothetically perfect man. And
as individuals or as groups?
As individuals and as groups.
Right. Okay. So I mean, you've accepted that there are multiple moralities. You even cited one with the blue paint example. Like, obviously, I think we both agree that's a terrible morality to adopt, just to arbitrarily bring.
It's just a toy example. It's just a toy example to show how conditional moral statements, like, it could you could say in this universe, it's just objectively better for things to be blue. but I can create a red machine to create blue paint and still be right under the blue morality, right?
Right. So my view of morality is very mechanistic, very descriptive. So obviously I feel that I could potentially rank order moralities. My sense of it is that it's dependent upon the environment, that the environment somewhat shapes the morality.
Well, how
So,
would you rank? Could you describe the process of rank ordering moralities?
well, obviously, if a morality generated a lot of human suffering, I think that obviously that would be worse than
Okay,
one
but
who
now we need a
didn't.
definition of what human is, right?
Yes, yeah.
And so now we kind of, like I said before, the goal of the humanist morality is to essentially procure human well-being. And that's fine, right? That worked for a while. Some philosophical quibbling here and there, but I highly recommend, and I know that Paul Vanderklee recommended this book too, C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man, because I feel that the fundamental question is, what is human, and is it proper, beyond just holding back human suffering? Does morality also recommend that we become
Well,
better humans?
I'm not saying that that's the only component by any means. I'm just saying if you gave me two moralities and one contained a lot of human suffering and the other contained less human suffering, that's the morality I would rank order above the morality. I'm not saying that that's the highest morality or that humans should be striving for human well-being or any of that kind of stuff.
Okay, well, even if it's just decreasing human suffering, there's still a question of what is human.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And we could argue over that. There could be, a lot of people want to include any conscious creature into their moral system. So there is arguments over what is human, but this adds to the idea that morality is completely subjective. I think where people are upset when people claim morality is objective, it just their sensibilities about what objective means are what bristle. I mean,
I
morality is
mean, but
tough
this
enough
is,
to define, but
I mean,
objective is clear to define.
well, even in the mathematics case, I gave sort of two examples of how we could discuss whether mathematics is objective or not, right? We can ask whether people get the same answers if they do it correctly, formally.
Right.
And we could ask whether it points to something outside of the human concept of it. And those are two separate questions. So, but I will say that objective seems to be an easier thing. But this is sort of my thought process on this. And I used to come from this objective morality school. And I began to learn that sort of in a practical sense, like you're talking about it, regardless of what humans say about morality being subjective or totally internal to ourselves, everybody talks like they think morality is objective, and everyone's looking for things like meaning, which are tightly linked to sort of an objective concept of morality that's intersubjective that they can share with people. And moreover, it seems like everyone behaves as if they believe that morality is objective, or that it's outside of themselves. You can talk about dying for a cause, which doesn't make any sense if morality is subjective.
Yeah, but they're different subjects, and each individual believes that the world is exactly like them, just walking around in different bodies. So, I mean, just because someone internally believes that their morality is consistent with everyone else's doesn't necessarily mean that that's the case.
No, I'm not saying that they believe it. I'm saying that they can be subjectivists will tell you that they think it's noble to die for a cause, but they'll have a hard time telling you why.
Okay.
There's
I
also the question about, like, humans implicitly think that moral statements ought to be logically consistent, and that doesn't make any sense if all we're describing is sort of like human emotion, because emotions don't need to be logically consistent with each other. They just are, right?
Yes.
But there's an implicit, even among people who preach that morality is subjective, there is an implicit understanding that moral statements have to be self-consistent or consistent with other moral statements you make. But that doesn't make any sense to me. So just anthropologically, in a practical sense, I realize that regardless of whether we believe in some kind of ultimate morality in a Platonic or a Christian or an Aristotelian sense, we're stuck with a humanity that is sort of primed to deal with morality as an objective feature and not as a subjective product of emotion.
So how do you get to, what is your, this is something that we went back and forth on our previous stream. For me, objective comes down to some form of measurement that everyone can agree on. I'm using the general term objective, as in length, width, height. These things are objective. We all have agreed upon ways of measuring them. What is the agreed upon way of measuring morality in your system?
Well, I mean, in everyone's system, the way to measure morality is to measure an impact on a perceived value, right?
Right.
And so the thing is, and I'll say this in the sense of the first sense of objective that you used here, aka the formal consistency of the language, I will maintain that once you narrow people down to philosophical preconceptions and communities, people's moral instinct and our moral responses are remarkably consistent.
And consistent how?
And that they tend to value they'll give you the same answers for moral questions, right? So, like, for instance, like if you go to the Catholic community and like say, okay, like, is it good or bad to be martyred for your faith? Like the Catholic community will overwhelmingly, like at 99%, will say yes, it's good to be martyred for your faith, right? You should die rather than give up your faith. So once you go into that community, the response, it's not like, oh, you catch a Catholic, on a bad day and he says like, oh, being martyred for your faith is a bad idea. But then you go to a Catholic on a good day, or another Catholic who, is from a different country, or, and then they give you the opposite answer. Once you narrow it down into perspectives, into schools, the answers become incredibly consistent.
Yeah, but that is a group of people that have opted into a consistent moral framework. So
no, exactly. So I'm saying is once you solidify what's valuable in the frameworks, the answers become very consistent, right? The problem is at the end of the day is how do we structure the system of value, right?
Because, and how do you measure that system against another system? What is the measurement?
I mean, I don't think that there's a formal system. I do not think that there's a formal system for measuring morality.
So when you're talking about objective morality, you're only talking about individual statements. You're not talking about how those statements fit together. What you're saying is, on this one statement, we can all agree objectively that this is the case. This is the truth value. If in this situation, do X.
Wait, no, that's the opposite of what I'm saying. I guess. Okay, so what, are you asking me, like, what are the criteria that I use to pick one value system over another?
Yes. If you're saying that one moral system, together we can say that one person is objectively taller than another person because we have a ruler and we measure those people. And
because that's an empirical quantity, but we're not talking about empirical quantities anymore. We're talking about.
So morality is not empirical.
No, okay, that's for sure. No one says that morality is empirical.
Okay.
I mean, the develop, like, describing it anthropologically, describing it in how it arose is empirical. But just like mathematics arose in humans through a means that is we can empirically measure.
How do we
empirically demonstrate? But mathematics itself, the practice of mathematics, is not empirical; it is strictly rational. We did not discover the Pythagorean theorem by empirically measuring triangles. Yeah.
How do we hold people accountable for their behavior if we don't use evidence, empiricism, that kind of thing?
But that's a separate question. Like, we're jumping around a lot. The first question we said is how would, I guess it's how would an individual develop? I mean, because the humans have always used law and laws. They've used formalized rules and heuristics to hold people accountable. And then the empirical method, the only empirical component, I mean, there is sort of an empirical component of law, and that law usually has practical considerations on top of moral considerations, and the practical considerations need to be empirical. But when it comes to holding people accountable in a setting, in a judicial setting, the empirical nature comes into proving that an action was committed or was not committed, which is not the same thing as developing the moral system or to begin with, right? I mean, I would say if you came down to me personally, I would look for several things in a moral system to be consistent. The first thing is and this is both formal and not formal. The first thing is that I check it for consistency, because I deeply believe that moral systems should be consistent. I don't know why I believe moral systems should be consistent, but there's a deep sense in me that they should be.
Consistency is something we can definitely check for, at least objectively.
Oh yeah, we can objectively check for philosophical consistency of moral statements, right? The second thing I would look for is that if the moral system leads to practical human thriving, in the sense that it allows humans to function as I believe they should. And then the third thing I check it for is the moral system hold up an image of how humans should be. Does it hold up an image of the ideal human that is very much in line with how I believe humans should ideally be? So those are three. They're all things that we can empirically check, but you'll notice that in all three of those cases, the only thing I could back it up to was a feeling that that's the way morality should be. And the three things were: it's philosophically consistent logically, it leads to human thriving practically, and that it holds up an image of what humans should strive towards that is in line with my intuitions about what humans should be. And so I think that's really it. And I will maintain that this practical humanism is very much on display in Christianity.
So you're saying logical consistency is important. You're saying leading to thriving is important and contains archetypical examples for people to live up to.
Well, no, the third one is actually a little bit more sophisticated than that. It holds up an archetypical example of what a human should be and what human society should be in the ideal. So it's not just like helping people thrive as what they are, but it actually is like, this is how we can get beyond what we are to an ideal kind of human or human society. And I think that this is this is not Christianity. This is my own practical little thing that I developed, but in my mind, it was pursuing this kind of a thought that kind of led me eventually to the Christian worldview.
Right. And I was going to ask you, what is the goal of Catholicism? But I think you've already told me here with the consistency, the thriving, and the archetypes.
Catholicism is not distinguished by that. I think all rational systems are distinguished by that, right? I think Islam is too. Catholicism is the Catholic Church is a particular philosophical, it's not one, it's two, it's the unification of two historical philosophical systems, the pagan rational system and the Jewish tradition, with one radical historical claim being Christ Jesus's incarnation and Christ Jesus as the eternal form of the ideal man, and his statements about society of being the ideal pattern of the kingdom of God. So in some sense, you could say that Catholicism is the template that I laid out about philosophical consistency, human thriving, and the ideal vision of the human. But it's that template with the specific image of Christ superimposed to answer the questions that you could obviously fill in for the implicit questions the template asks. Right? What is the ideal man? Jesus. What is the ideal human society? The kingdom of God, as Jesus laid out, right? And then so on and so forth, right?
Well, I was going to ask you though, do any of these ever come into conflict?
If I could be shown that there weren't apparent contradictions in Christianity, because obviously Christianity is fulfilled with apparent contradictions, but if there was an actual contradiction in Christianity, then I would have to discard that worldview.
Well, I was thinking more in terms of if a product of the natural world appears to be that inconsistency leads to thriving, or perhaps bad archetypes, or what you would consider bad archetypes in Christianity lead to thriving. Like if it's, I guess that would make it internally inconsistent if that was the case. If one of your highest values was consistency, but inconsistency actually led to greater thriving. What's thriving? I don't even know how you measure that.
I can imagine how that might be, but only in a really silly toy example. I have a hard time practically imagining how that could be.
Yeah, it seems difficult for me even to imagine those things evolving. But it's
an interesting toy. Don't get me wrong, right?
I'm skeptical of consistency, just because I think consistency evolved for evolutionary reasons, and I think it's counterintuitive that inconsistency is sometimes a better way to go. I think this is what leads us to, the optimism bias and all kinds of other things where we would be better off if we abandoned certain strategies, but we keep those strategies just to maintain consistency for unnecessary reasons.
I'm not sure I follow. I'm sorry.
There are cases where you would want to be inconsistent. That it would be a better strategy to be inconsistent.
There are places where we need to be practically inconsistent. A classic example, and this has been something that Christians have struggled with a long time, is war. Now, Thomas Aquinas talks about war a lot, and he says that, and Thomas Aquinas was a person who believed that, basically he was, and I'm massively paraphrasing here, offended, so forgive the Thomas who are going to jump on me.
You've got your friends in the chat that are going to get mad at you.
Yeah, I know they are, but I'm not really that studied of a Thomist. But Thomas Aquinas' chief goal was to take the apparent contradictions of Christianity and model them and explain how they weren't true contradictions, which I don't believe that they are. Right. Basically, he was, and a lot of the stuff he comes up with had to do with war, because in many ways, war itself is not very Christian, but in other ways, it's practically necessary to have a thriving Christian nation, especially in an era like the 13th century when Thomas Aquinas wrote. And so Thomas Aquinas tried to develop an idea, a practical, somewhat Christian Aristotelian idea about how we could conduct war in a way that would be permissible and in many ways Christian, at the same time that we can bring it, and basically to reconcile the thriving and this leads to things. And again, this is massively talked about in Christian literature. If you read C.S. Lewis and you read, and basically any Christian philosopher ever, they'll ask how Christians can kill. And the solution usually comes up with, we have to spiritually, we have to, first of all, it has to be completely just in the sense of the just war theory. We have to properly consider these grave actions ahead of us. But at the same time, we also have to make sure that we don't sort of give in to the natural evilness of killing. We have to say, okay, this is necessary, but we're undertaking this for a greater good and with full repentance for the evil we have to commit in the name of that.
Yeah, I'm already seeing, I mean, you're bringing up the problems with the consistency thing. Is there an archetypal human that is useful in all situations? And it really doesn't seem like there is. I mean, the term the other cheek Jesus is not good when people are storming your shores.
Well, yeah, but I don't come to bring peace, but a sword Jesus is.
Right, but then
Jesus as he existed and not how as he's portrayed by progressive Christians is a character of supreme complexity and one that is no, I'm serious. Like he's like, how do you not a Christian? He's a fascinating character.
How do you emulate? How do you put the someone with supreme complexity up as an archetype for people to model themselves on? Because then aren't you just asking everybody to be supremely complex, and then therefore just you don't really even have an archetype at all?
But I think this is why people sort of use simplified understandings of Christians, of Christ. I don't think it's possible to look at Christ and I I've studied a lot about Christianity. I don't really feel like I quite understand Christ in entirety. The only way I can understand it is by following great spiritual masters who have broken it down for me in much more followable forms. So after in the gospel itself, like if we just have the, I mean, sorry, is this boring people? But okay, well, this is just my own experience, right? I feel like I'm just gonna get moshed when because I feel like I'm gonna be tracking into heresy. But my belief is that the gospels as they stand are this magnificent spiritual journey, but something that's so confounding that it's very difficult to make sense of them. And that's why right from the get-go, St. Paul had to immediately start interpreting the mystery of the Gospels into something that can be followed practically. So you'll notice that many of the practical moral rules Christians follows come from St. Paul. They're obviously based on things done and taught by Jesus, but we need to for humans, we need to sort of step back and go, okay, well, this is the ideal, but it's way too complex. We need to make it more simple and use these priorities in our life, right?
Right. So the power of science is really in its objectivity, and I think that's another reason why people have a problem with people who talk about objective morality. And I think it's also why people tend to want to ground an ethic in science, in factual reality, is because they feel that that's a very powerful thing in the fact that it is objective, and people are basically forced by the evidence to buy into this ethic.
But I mean, but they're trying to do sort of like a hand wavy woo woo thing, though. You can't. They're trying to get an empirical ought statement from. They're trying to get an imperative ought statement from a descriptive is statement.
How do you know that it's? How do you know that it's woo woo? And I don't disagree that there are plenty of cases.
Linguistically rational. Like, how do you go from is to ought?
Setting aside the is ought situation just because it's complicated, I think part of my project is really finding certain behavioral patterns that are beneficial and backed up by scientific rigor, and noticing where ancient wisdom and those things that we've discovered scientifically are valuable intersect. Like I'm constantly talking about the idea of forgiveness, which I say is the highest meme in Christianity. It's very logical to me why that is such a powerful idea when you understand that idea completely goes against our biology. It's a cultural adaptation that really makes modern civilization possible.
Hmm.
So grounding that idea in scientific understanding, in empirical evidence, seems like it would create a wider buy-in in society. I mean, you're only able to say that forgiveness is a good thing because of my religious ethical system. Isn't it more powerful if we can say, well, not only does the religious ethical system, not only have these people discovered it over time and incorporated into their religious system, but we also have scientific evidence that backs up the reason why they discovered it. Doesn't that just make the morality more palatable for more people?
I guess. I mean, you could put it that way if you want to. And I guess if we're going to live in sort of a multi-faith society, you would have to. I'm not so sure. I mean,
I mean, it's almost like I'm agreeing with you, but you just don't like the reasons I'm agreeing with you.
Well, you're maybe I'm not understanding you. You're saying that if we can provide reasons for forgiveness that aren't spiritual, then we could make more people forgiving, I guess.
Yeah, basically, yeah. Or at least give them a see the problem that I have is we have so many atheists now who are not going to ground their morality in any kind of religious faith.
Mm-hmm.
We need to give them something to ground their morality in, and what they're trying to ground their morality in is science. And I think that there is some overlap between the scientific understanding of morality and the religious understanding of morality, and I just don't see why we have to be at each other's throats when there is that overlap.
Well, I don't think that there. I mean, as long as we get the questions right, I don't think there needs to be any necessary conflict between science. I think that's largely contrived. You know, I don't want to say Enlightenment propaganda. People who listen to my channel know that I'm a little bit of an Enlightenment skeptic. But you know, insofar as, I mean, you're right that forgiveness is a trope in Christianity, more so than it was in the religions that were both its contemporaries and its predecessors.
Isn't forgiveness really the highest ideal?
Well, I would consider, so in Christianity, and that this is definitely showing my Catholic hand here, there were classically there were four virtues discussed by Aristotle, and there were three that Christians in the early Middle Ages felt that Jesus brought to the table. So the four ones discussed by Aristotle were fortitude, justice, prudence, and temperance. Temperance meaning that you control your own emotions, your own desires, so you don't do things stupid. Prudence meaning that you have good judgment and keen intellect to do the right thing at the right time. Fortitude meaning that you're going to be courageous and not give in to fear, and be constant in your ideas. And justice meaning that you can correctly do what people deserve, right? So, you know, if somebody did something wrong, you mete out the proper judgment for that. Christians believe that that in addition to these, there were three sort of supernatural virtues that were brought to the table, and that those were what they say is, they say like humility, love, charity, and faith. And these virtues essentially are supernatural because the Christian forgiveness is supposed to be, okay, well, even if justice commands that this person has done something wrong that would discredit him, we're obliged to kind of take a step back and suspend that for the greater good of charity, because the idea of forgiveness in a Christian sense, it's supposed to be that humanity is depraved, and by justice we should be destroyed. But God's forgiveness, his love, his charity, his agape, means that we aren't, that we are somehow saved. And so we are obliged to mirror that to fellow people, even though our instinct for justice is telling us that punishment needs to be meted out. And this is this is one of, I wouldn't say forgiveness is the pinnacle, but it is that what we call charity or divine love. Well, I mean, what do you mean? You mean like, I think that the three new values are faith, humility, and charity. And forgiveness being charity, right? Forgiveness being an extension of love or charity or whatever you want to call it, Christian love or whatnot. That's
what is the central story of Christianity?
Jesus. I mean, what would you like? How much do you want me to say? How long do you got?
He's the protagonist. Well, I think the Passion story is probably the that's John the central story of Christianity, right? Yeah, Jesus died for.
Well, I mean, John 3:16 is for God loved the world so that.
So when you said humility, I can trace humility back to that. What were the other ones that you said?
Well, you can trace all of them back to that.
I guess you can trace faith back to that.
Faith goes back to that. Also charity, right? Because God loved the world. Did he love it because it, by Aristotelian justice, deserved to be loved? Well, of course he didn't, right? Because by Aristotelian justice, how could something more beautiful love something that's less beautiful than it, right? By its very nature, it couldn't.
Right. So
you're right. In John 3:16, we have both. We have both faith, hope, love, and humility, and all and forgiveness, as you're saying, all rolled up into that narrative. It's the whole gospel is a demonstration. I mean, in addition to many other things that I don't fully understand, it is a demonstration of how those virtues need to reign over the classical pagan ones.
Right, and my whole idea is just that these ethics, these virtue ethics that you're talking about, are great pro-social adaptations for humanity. I think they evolved in us. I think they are put into the culture through this religious architecture that we've inherited. I don't see how it's unhelpful to ground those same ethics in some kind of scientific rigor for those that may have opted out of the religious system. I mean, they still need an ethical system. I think you'd agree there.
Yeah, and I think that, if are you asking? Yeah, I keep on. This conversation is so treacherous because, you tread so closely to the definition's limits that we have to be kind of careful. So, do you mean like how would I develop secular law? Is that what we're talking about?
Well, we are developing secular law together.
Yes, whether we should or not.
I'm saying that my understanding of ethical systems is that we have a certain psychology that we've inherited in our genes. And this even maps onto the Christian narrative very well. I mean, I conceptualize Christianity as kind of this narrative technology that was a cultural adaptation that we designed. I mean, I'm using the word designed in quotes, basically. I think it emerged, it evolved. It's inherited wisdom. It's what has worked in the past. You would say that it's delivered from God, but I don't think it's necessary.
I would make an anthropological quibble from my reading of Western history is this: that before Christianity we had paganism, which is not completely accurate. What we had was we had high paganism, which is we had like the plebs were given like these Apolloian gods that no one really believed in, and then the leaders followed Aristotle and Plato and developed, depending on which ruler you went to, either a Platonic or Aristotelian notion of law and the good of the collective. And then this Platonic and Aristotelian civilization of Rome kind of hit a snag. And then through pure happenstance of historical circumstances that I don't think would be repeated if you hit reset and played it back again, at least not without divine intervention, Christianity, which was a version that was in the tradition of this thing, but had a radical deviation from it, came to power and developed a new modification on the society that led to a radical transformation of how humans interact in the Christian era. And since then, that's created our current concept of Western, of the West as we know it today. Now, I think the eternal debate is over how much of this stuff comes from Aristotle and how much of it was part of the unique nature of the Christian religion. And I think you can break this down fairly easily. But sorry, does that answer that? That's sort of how I anthropologically.
Well, origin aside, I was kind of getting just to the fact that I think you and I will both agree that something like humility is good to foster in our culture. I don't think people are innately humble.
No,
I think that our genes teach us not or bestow behavior on us that is not engaging in humility. And in order for us to transform human beings who are not humble by their genes, we have a cultural apparatus that instills that for other reasons. And I would say that those other reasons are to make Western civilization possible, to make society possible. The old justifications for people being humble were this archetype of Jesus, this religious system that a lot of people are opting out of. I think that we can, if we put any effort into it, find scientific ways to prove, in effect, that humility is a better course of action, a better behavior than not being humble.
I mean, better for who?
Better for society and better for the individual as well.
Well, well, I mean, this is the problem when it comes to morality, at least in the post-Enlightenment age, and it's always has been this, is that if we're debunking things, then the concept of society also gets debunked.
What
right?
What do you mean debunking? I'm not.
Well, if so the idea that what do you mean by society? You mean a collection of beings we call human, right?
Americans.
Well, sure, but I don't mean debunking. I mean demystifying, right? So like,
well, that's a separate question. Whether or not it can still work.
I need to say to the audience, like we've dived into such a philosophical deep end right now that we're never going to get to the bottom of this in the time we have allotted. But bear with me here, like, because let's go. I like using the Greeks to take the whole emotion of Christianity out of it. Like the Greeks believed that like society qua society had this spiritual nature to it, right? Like Socrates talks about the city-state, right? And he's talking about something that in many ways is a religious cult of the times. Current man does not see society as some kind of good in itself. He sees society only as good insofar as it delivers benefits to people in it. So if we're going to demystify society, what we're talking about is a collection of individuals. And in that collection of individuals, some people are going to get less and some people are going to get more. So if you're going to an individual and saying humility is good, he might even agree, but he'll say like, okay, well, humility is good for those people, but I'm in it for number one. So they can be humble and society can thrive, and I can be the one who looks out for myself, and then I'll be part of the people who don't be humble, because not everyone needs to be humble. The same thing is true for people who are going to die in war, right? Society is fighting Nazi Germany, but only some people are going to get shot on the beaches of Normandy.
You're talking about bringing cheaters into line, which I think we can explain scientifically.
It's not even being cheaters. I mean, it only works if the people who aren't on the front
critical
line,
mass. It only works if enough people buy into it.
I mean, so is described to me under this morality.
You're saying that in a group of people who have all adopted the ethic of humility, the guy who doesn't adopt that ethic is better off than the people who do, and that he will realize that immediately, and you'll get other defectors. But I mean, the whole idea behind a religious system is to be able to bring those cheaters into line, and I'm giving you another tool to bring those cheaters into line, or ostracizing them from the group.
I think that, like, for instance, like, I mean, we're speaking in two different ways. Is a languager developing something? I mean, you're not going to talk somebody into dying for his country because it will be good for him ultimately. Like, that's impossible, right?
Well, what do you think? How do we get people to die for our country now?
Because they have an idea of the country as a holy object.
Right. You don't think they were talked into that
self?
You don't think they were talked into that idea? You think that idea?
I don't think they were taught. I don't think that they were talked. I don't think it's innate. I think that they were.
Okay, so it's cultural. They were talked into it.
Okay, maybe we're using different definitions of talked into it. There wasn't a rational argument for why it's good to die for your society. There was an implicit understanding that society was wholly communicated to them by their parents in terms of values. And then they carried those values into adulthood, and now they're ready to lay down their lives. There was never a dialectic in some kind of Socratic sense where they got talked into dying for or believing that they should die for their country.
Okay.
Starting with the premise that I'm looking out for my own self-interests. I don't think that ever happened to anybody.
I mean, you seem to be talking around the idea of we have a best case scenario where we have an agreed upon moral system, and it would be best if everybody adopted that moral system because it would be internally consistent and would lead to thriving, and we would all be focusing on the same archetypes. And then there are the cheaters that could come along and destroy that moral system. So I mean, you're talking about it in a different way.
The cheater makes the problem sound simpler than it is.
I'm making the problem sound simpler than it is?
No, the use of cheaters makes the problem sound simpler than what it is.
If everybody,
Because
if
in
everybody
order for
agrees,
society to thrive, we don't, because cheater means that, like, I'm literally committing an act of will to maliciously benefit from people.
Mhm.
In this instance, society is not going to thrive. If we're using like the D-Day example, society is not going to thrive just by avoiding people who, through malicious action, are going to hurt people for their own benefit. Society won't thrive unless people, through their own humble and self-giving action, are not going to lay their lives down for a collective in a future that they'll never see. So it's actually a much deeper problem, right? It's not just cracking down on people who do things bad. You actually have to encourage people to do things that are selfless.
yeah, I agree. I think the whole idea of morality is turning selfish individuals into selfless individuals. I think
Okay.
selflessness is the root of morality.
And my point is that you're not going to argue someone into being selfless for rationally appealing to down the line arguments having to do with self-interest. They have to believe something
But you
outside of
can
themselves is
you
valuable.
you
Ultimately.
you can think up ways that they could be argued into it for selfish reasons,
Like
though.
argued, like, but like, what's the starting value? Like, you're like pretend you're sitting down with somebody like in a bar in before they kick off D-Day, and the guy's like, this guy's like a volunteer. Like, it's a ridiculous example, but let's say he has a choice about
I
whether to
mean,
get on the ship, right? Like, and you're like, oh, like, and he's like, yeah, like, I just want to be happy. How can I be happy if I get shot by German machine guns? You can't, like, and I don't think that anyone has an argument based on self-interest why somebody should charge a machine gun nest.
right. Well, obviously any kind of we're devising thought experiments to prove
Well,
our
you do
point.
have an argument if the person believes that there's something outside of his own mind that is more valuable than his own mind.
Yeah, I think it's a great adaptation. Yeah, I do think
Okay,
the
but
whole idea, I mean, that's how you're
so now
arguing
what
them
you're
into
relying on,
charging
if you're
the machine gun nest. You're saying, "Listen, this isn't it. Even if you die, your spirit's gonna go on, you're gonna live forever." That's a self-interest argument, it is.
you don't need to believe that your spirit is immortal to charge a machine gun nest. The Japanese who were kamikaze pilots
Right,
largely did not believe in a life after death, but they did believe that the glory of the Japanese empire was bigger than themselves and better and more valuable. That's what they
right.
did believe. So what we're saying here is, if we go back to the two meanings of objective, the first one being that you can repeat it formally and everyone gets the same answer. The second one, if you remember, was the idea that the value exists outside of your own mind and is not just a product of your mind, right? So what we're saying here is that in order to get people to charge machine gun nests and to die selflessly in battle, true or not, we're relying on the fact that they possess a concept of objective morality, whether or not that concept is a noble lie or actually true or not.
Hmm. Okay. I know we were only gonna talk for about an hour. We've been talking for about an hour now. I have a couple super chats that might be questions for you, so let
Okay,
me just
sure
read
thing.
those.
Yeah, let's.
Uh,
This is such a big question, Brendan. Like, we could talk about this every month, and we probably would. Hopefully, this is interesting for people.
Yeah, let us know in the comments below your thoughts. I mean, you understand that I'm looking at this. I'm trying to look at it very materialistically, just because I feel there are a lot of people who live in this materialist paradigm that I think find it useful to think of it materialistically.
Well,
So,
I'm a methodological materialist myself.
okay.
Like, I'm trying to come at this separating my own Christianity from the question as much. I mean, as much as I can. Obviously, right? It's always impossible to do that completely.
So the rightful king of Finland asked thoughts on ethical naturalism. That's got to be you. I'm not sure.
What is ethical?
Yeah,
Is
I
ethical
was like,
naturalism?
I don't know what ethical naturalism is. So there you go. There's some thoughts on it.
I mean,
My thoughts
I
are we
know what
need to Google it.
methodological
What are your
naturalism is. I'm a methodological naturalist when it comes to science. No
right?
one's a methodological naturalist when it comes to mathematics. Otherwise, you wouldn't use imaginary numbers, because show me an imaginary number in nature.
Why don't you give us your real quick definition of methodological naturalism?
Methodological naturalism means that when you're methodologically doing something, you assume that there is nothing outside the natural world. So, I don't know. I'm going to say I believe that miracles exist, but I don't know if miracles are something that happens or not. I've never witnessed one, right? But when I do a scientific experiment, I have to exclude miraculous nature, and I have to assume that there is a consistent way that nature works. Otherwise, when I reject the null hypothesis or fail to reject the null hypothesis, I will not have properly. I could always attribute the observations to a miraculous event that won't be repeated in the future, and therefore no scientific conclusion could ever be embraced. So that's methodological naturalism, assuming that only things in nature could ever occur.
I agree with that. And I think when we debate public policy, this is the tack that we should all take.
Yeah, I agree. I agree that Christians, when they debate public policy, should be methodological naturalists. You should not rely on a miracle. But here's the thing: you're methodological naturalists only after everyone in the room agrees on the implicit value of what's being pursued. Being methodologically naturalist when there's open ethical questions on the ground is stupid, because then you just you have everyone trying to justify their own implicit feelings about what ought to be valuable by pointing to what is, and that's just meaningless. That's just meaningless verbiage.
Right. So trans T99FL for $10 says, not only does I think he means not only does Christianity work, it has social utility, but it's also true, historically accurate. You seem to be missing the latter. So,
well, we're not discussing the latter on this stream. Obviously, as a Christian,
you are.
Christianity is. No, in my personal life, I believe Christianity is historically accurate, but Christianity being accurate has nothing to do with what we're talking about today.
Well, you're bringing up the origins of it down to where it came from. So obviously you have more.
I mean, if Christ is risen and Christ is Lord, then Christianity could be the most unutilizable, ridiculous thing ever, and people should still follow it. But that's not what we're discussing right now. I presume. I don't know. Maybe we are.
I do actually think that there is value in it. There's more value in things that are true. And this is just an innate part of our human psychology that we place higher value on narrative stories that are actually true. So I do think that just a lot of times new atheists or anti-theists will say that, Christianity is untrue. All of this is fiction. So why can't we adopt other fictional stories that may produce an ethic that is more valuable? And I don't necessarily think that that's a possibility, just because the truth value of a story seems to make people understand it better or take it to heart better. I'm not sure the right way to look at it. But I mean, even you can see evidence of this in Hollywood movies. They constantly want to say based on a true story because it makes the movie more popular. So,
well, I mean, I feel like that's in the rabbit hole, but I noticed that there's a clarification about what ethical naturalism is. Can moral claims be reduced to natural properties equals ethical naturalism? Well, we can explain how ethical perspectives arise genetically, just like we can explain how mathematical instincts and mathematical claims arise naturally. I don't think that tells you which theorems are correct or whether a mathematical formula or an ethical formulation can be true in a philosophical sense. I think they're separate questions.
Doesn't it give you supplemental evidence though for your ethical claims?
I think it would be hard to imagine that there was an oughtness in the universe, or that there was an Aristotelian god or a Platonic god or a Christian god in the universe, and that humans' ethical instinct differed greatly from that divine ethical instinct. I could imagine the universe existing, but it would be a little bit hard for me to believe. So I guess, in some sense, this is the concept of natural law, the idea that humans implicitly have moral instincts that are fundamentally correct and that leave human thriving built inside of them.
Yeah, that's my big question right there. That's a big question on the table for me, is that if it's evolutionarily beneficial, is it always morally beneficial? Is it morally correct?
And natural law gets you a long way. Natural law,
Really?
yeah, it does. It gets you, like, natural law with the proper cultural institutions will get you Thomas Jefferson, right?
Hmm.
Like Christian cultural norms that don't get questioned, plus a concept of natural law, will get you Sweden, right?
Hmm.
But natural law starts breaking down when you prod it with, when you prod it with sort of genetic arguments and deconstruction and Freudian analysis and all the things that we've been doing since the 60s. Because then natural law just becomes another product that we're saddled with. And it gives people all sorts of excuses to break the natural law in applications that are individualistically beneficial to them, but collectively disastrous. An example that people who watch my channel will know I like using is the sexual revolution, which I can't think of a better example of something that just has so many demonstrable downsides for the collectivity of society. But when the natural law, when the cultural norms against it were loosened, the individual arguments to break the rules were just too compelling, and the whole sexual norms of Western civilization just went into the dustbin in an order of like 15 years.
Is this potentially why you're intuitively suspect of any kind of supplemental scientific or empirical evidence for your ethical claims, because you feel like that evidence could be used as means to get out of the ethical norm?
I don't think that a scientific explanation I mean, I disagree that the sexual revolution was undone by a scientific explanation about why those norms exist.
But just not necessarily
all the Christian. Here's the thing. What's so ironic, friend, is that the Christian ethics that secularists like the most has the hardest to come up with a scientific explanation for.
Which would those be?
Forgiving your enemies, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Secularists love that one, but it's very hard to come up with a scientific explanation of why that exists. Whereas the Christian ethics that secularists usually, I'm not saying you do, but most secularists hate the most, which are the sexual ethics, it's the easiest to come up with an explanation of why they're conducive. Every Christian from the beginning of time, Jesus doesn't talk very much about sex. He talks a little bit about it, but not a ton. But Christians always pointed to the fact that if you didn't have sexual ethics, society would just collapse, right? What killed sexual ethics was not some kind of naturalistic explanation for them. Christians use naturalistic explanations for the sexual ethics, going all the way back to the Torah. Or Christians didn't exist when the Torah was written, but that's beside the point. What killed sexual ethics was progesterone-based birth control.
So I have a couple more super chats here.
Sure.
I know you want to get out by 2. So the rightful king of Finland says moral properties reducible to natural properties. Yeah, that's the ethical naturalism we were talking about. And Paul Cornelius for $2 says, what are the uses of height for the right wing movement? I think RW movement.
Yeah.
So what are the uses of height for the right wing movement? I'm technically on the left, so.
Well, I think that, I mean, there's the right wing movement and there's sort of the counter progressive movement generally, and I think that almost everyone who's not explicitly on the left wing train will eventually join the counter progressive movement in some form, because I think that progressivism is just unstoppable at this stage for a variety of reasons that I've gone in my other videos. The usefulness of height in the right-wing movement is the fact that he unseats the previous orthodoxy, which was explicitly leftist. The previous orthodoxy concerning the anthropological origin of ethical systems was that every single ethical instinct was a derivation of an instinct that had to do with care and harm. Essentially, it was endorsing the progressive instinct towards ethics implicitly. It was saying that the reason why you care about liberty is care and harm. The reason why you care about sanctity is care or harm. Whereas Jonathan Haidt said, well, it's apparent that human beings care about these other moral foundations in a way that in many ways is autonomous from how they care about care and harm. And it really is a multidimensional system and not a single dimensional system. And I think that is revolutionary because it puts us back on a framework for understanding morality in a more complex way. And in my opinion, one that re-ups the fundamental right-wing question, which is what is the ideal human?
Yeah,
what does it mean to be human?
Just to put a button on it too, I mean, Haidt is so convinced that the leftist paradigm is so ever present in society that he only has 3 laws or 3 rules of moral foundations, and the second one is aimed completely at liberals. Morality is more than just harm and fairness. So, I mean,
well, I would say progressives because I like saying liberals and progressives are fundamentally different. I think liberals are focused on a concept like sort of this 18th century concept of liberty and autonomy, whereas progressives are totally focused on caring and harm.
I'm old where liberals and progressives were interchangeable when I adopted my political views. So it's difficult to switch over. So, but I do try to make the distinction. Yes, progressives are definitely the ones that have that worldview.
Yeah, I think everyone here should read Jonathan Haidt. He's a brilliant Is he an anthropologist? I don't know, but
he's social psychologist.
Have you read? But here's the other book I'd recommend. Have you read The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis?
No. Everyone,
it's totally worth it. It's really short. It's just 3 lectures. And it asks like a number of really fundamental questions for what we're discussing here. He explores why natural law is needed. He calls it the Tao because to him the Taoism was an example of natural law totally independent from the Christian tradition, and he compares how that interacts with technology, which is really interesting, I think.
Well, I'll check it out. Do you want to pitch anything you have coming up in the near future, or your social media or anything?
Well, I don't know. I actually am going in a totally opposite direction. People have asked me to do a video on distributism, and I've been dreading it my entire career, but I think I'm gonna finally have to make a video on that.
It's the name of your channel,
and it's gonna suck. Yeah, I know it's gonna really suck, but I'm gonna try to do as good a job as I can. But if people are interested in history and morality, I did have a video that was a little bit popular on the super blogger Mencius Moleblug, who is important if anyone wants to understand the beginning of sort of neo-reactionary and distant right-wing ideas as they originated in the late 2000s.
Yeah, we should mention, I was listening to a podcast and they were calling Mencius Moleblug alt-right, like an alt-right figurehead or something like that.
It's not exactly accurate. He was what's called neo-reactionary.
Yeah, I thought it was wrong because you came out pretty hard against the alt-right in your alt-right series.
And alt-right's one of these things that doesn't mean alt-right, when it was originally coined, was more or less used interchangeably with neo-reactionary. But then Richard Spencer got a hold of it, and starting around 2016, alt-right went from being neo-reactionary, distant right, to meaning neo-reactionary and you're a white nationalist.
Yeah, which is a terrible conflation.
Both neo-reactionaries and white nationalists were on the outs with mainstream conservatism. That's true. But Mencius Moleblug was not somebody who cared particularly about race, and neither am I.
Yeah.
So while many people who are white nationalists are neo-reactionaries, neo-reactionarianism is basically it's a historical theory. It doesn't really have anything to do with race. But I do understand that a lot of people who were white nationalists do prefer the neo-reactionary historical and technological theory. So there's some connection there.
Well, everyone should check out that Mencius Moleblug video. I think it's probably your best video. I honestly do.
Really? Yeah. Well, thank you.
As someone who really enjoys just diving into the ideas, I think there's a lot of really amazing ideas in there. So everyone should check it out.
They're taken from earlier Catholic and earlier 20th century thought. Mencius Moleblug is more or less a unifier rather than somebody who he developed some of these things himself, but mostly he was just weaving other ideas together in a way, I think, which time had come, right?
Right. It seems funny that people are labeling progressives as regressives now, because it completely plays into the idea that you were putting forward in that video.
Well, I mean, it's funny because it seems to imply that they're winning. Like when you call the university regressive, I don't know what it means. I mean, it's like getting fired out of a cannon and saying the cannon is that the cannon is flying, the cannon and the earth that it's attached to is flying away
backwards
into the sky backwards. I mean, you can say that if you want to, but like the universities are what creates the societal consensus in the long term. So you can say that the universities are regressive, and in a relativistic way, maybe, but they're what's attached to the ground. You're not.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's a great way to think of it.
So you know, I don't know what people mean by that. I think it's comforting to a lot of people because as long as you describe them as regressing, it seems like the problem is localized, whereas the problem is not localized. The problem is that a lot of how people thought society would work after we started deconstructing Western norms, starting with Christianity, but in the 60s moving forward to everything, a lot of the theories people had about how those things would work just turned out not to be true.
Paul Cornelius for $10 says, I just bought a brand new set of morals at Walmart for only $10. You got a deal.
It says Joshua Cornelius.
Oh, Joshua Cornelius.
There's another Cornelius in the chat. I never seen more than one Cornelius.
They must be brothers.
Yeah. Probably not.
So let's just end it here. I know you want to get out at 2. I'll give you a little bit extra time. So.
Well, I'm sorry for talking your ear off, friend. I felt like we just touched the surface.
No, I like this stuff because I can go back and listen to it again. And if there's anything I missed, you know, being on a live stream, you're trying to think, what am I going to say next at the same time that you're trying to absorb what they're saying. So
I just hope that the Thomists and the Aristotelians aren't going to skin me alive for making a minor mistake in explaining their ideology.
Well, I hope they are, just because that's the kind of guy I am. So
Thomists can be very not very. I mean, they were behind the Inquisition, so you gotta be careful with those guys, right?
Well, I hope they don't draw and quarter you.
Okay, well, thanks so much. It was a great talk. Great talk, my friend.
Take care, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for the super chats.